In today's episode of The Rig Doctor, we're going to be talking about soldered versus solderless cables. One of the big discussion points in the comments section of our last video, where I was comparing my thoughts on building pedal boards and best practices back in 2014 versus now, many of you mentioned that there are some influential YouTubers and people on social media that only use solderless connections, and we're using that as sort of a springboard for a discussion about soldered versus solderless. So I really want to get into that today. I want to talk to you about what the best practices are, what the science actually says in terms of the benefits of using a soldered connection versus solderless, and also introduce some of the rig builders that have been doing this all the way back to the mid-70s and why they also believe that soldered is the exclusive way to go if you need reliability in your rig. Again, as always, if you like the content that you see here, I highly recommend that you subscribe and also hit the bell icon. That's just going to update you with any new content that we're coming out with so that you know that we have something new for you to watch. If you want to support us further, you can always check out our website, vertexeffects.com, where we sell a variety of overdrive, distortions, boost, and compressors, or check out our dealer list so that you can try out one of our pedals at a dealership near you. I don't want to take up any more time. Let's get into it. Soldered versus solderless. Let's go. My name is Mason Marangella. I build rigs for the industry's top professionals. Now I'm teaching guitarists how to build rigs like the pros with DIY tips, easy mods, and all the tricks of the trade. I am the Rig Doctor. Soldered versus solderless. It's something that I can definitely see there are tons of misunderstandings around just by the conversations that I've had with many of you in the comments section over our last few videos, in particular the one I mentioned earlier where I'm comparing and contrasting some of my views on pedal boards and how it shifted between 2014 and now, and also some of just my pedal board best practices videos. Now, solderless cables do have a place in the market. I think they're great if you are new to pedal boards and you want to get started right away. There have certainly been some advancements made in the quality of solderless connectors since the old days. The Evidence SIS cables, which is the one that many of you are talking about, is certainly the best of the solderless varieties that are out there. It was very well thought out. I think that the cables are incredibly well made in terms of the actual cable itself. And there are some drawbacks, which we'll talk about later, but I think if you're a beginner, you don't know how to solder, and you don't want to make that investment in time in terms of learning to solder, it's definitely a good way to go, and you can get relatively good results comparatively to the other solderless varieties that are out there. Now, soldered cables, however, differ in one major way, and it's a way that I've talked about over and over again, so I apologize to those of you who have already heard me say this, but the most critical part that differentiates soldered versus solderless is that a soldered cable is a gas-tight connection. That means that where the shield is connected and where the center conductor are connected, that they risk little to no exposure to the elements. They're soldered and encapsulated onto the connector itself so that you don't have any risk of oxidation or corrosion of those connections. Now, oxidation and corrosion are inherent in most of the types of materials that are in cables, primarily copper, but you're mitigating the risk as much as possible when you encapsulate those exposed conductors and the exposed shield and completely entrapping that on the lugs. Because what's inherent in all cables is movement. So the center conductor, even on a soldered cable, if you are flexing it or moving the cable, there is movement in that conductor. Now, when you have a solderless connection that's relying on tension to hold that together, that movement becomes a problem. And the more it moves, the more you flex it, the more times you plug and unplug it or change the direction of the bend of the cable, you are compounding the effect of that movement on the reliability of the connector itself and of the cable. So the more times you mess with it, the more time that it's being manipulated, the less reliable it becomes. There's also another big thing that is inherent in all cables is vibration. You're playing on a stage, you're playing with other people, you're doing rehearsals, there's movement and vibration that gets into the cable. And as it vibrates, if there's a set screw or something that's relying on tension, it is slowly but surely releasing itself. And the more air that's exposed to that copper conductor in the center, the more air that's exposed to that shield, they are equally going to experience oxidation and corrosion, which is the enemy of a quality connection. Now, some of you have said, well, brand X screws into the center conductor and it has a solid core, so that's not a problem. Or others of you have said, well, this brand has a set screw and it goes in and it holds tension against the center conductor the entire time. In both cases, it's still, firstly, not a gas-tight connection, but secondly, with a set screw, you can only tighten it so much. If you tighten too much, then it actually goes through the entire conductor and then goes back into the wall of the shield again, and then you have a short. So you can't over-tighten those, and if you don't tighten them enough, then the screw is going to slowly back itself out. That's inherent in the set screw design. The other design, where you actually screw in the actual center conductor into the housing, there's a risk of something called cold flow, which means that the actual material, the copper, will change shape over time as there's pressure coming against it. That's something that you risk when you have something that screws in like that. And then if it cold flows, obviously you're not going to have as good of quality connection. As that gets worse, you may have no connection at all, but you're definitely going to be risking oxidation almost immediately once that gets any movement. And that's not even considering any sort of flexing that's going on. At the point with which the cable is made, it's already at risk. And then the more that it's actually used, plugged or unplugged, it's risking further damage to the actual connection. But beyond that, the shield is also equally important to make sure is gas tight. And in all of these soldered connections that I've seen, all of the shields are very exposed and don't get the same attention that the center conductor does. They're just relying on the outer housing to put enough tension to hold the ground. But they're completely exposed to the elements. The shield is just as important because it is the return of the signal. And with that exposed to the elements and is just as likely to oxidize as the center conductor, you're asking for a real problem. I've also noticed in the comments that as a validation point for why solderless connections are good is using a famous artist that's used a solderless cable to build a large rig, and then that being the reason for why it's a professional grade component. Now, I would caution anybody from using sort of the if-then fallacy. So for example, if well-known guitar player X uses solderless cables, then it must be a professional solution. It is a solution. I don't know that I would call it a professional one when I'm looking at the body of rig building professionals. However, one thing I will let you know, as somebody who's built hundreds of rigs, many of which were for high-profile professional guitarists, is that they rely on the discretion and the advice of the rig builder. So if I had a certain preference for cables or connectors or the type of buffers that I use, they would generally fall in step with those things. Or if those that didn't, they would generally say in the beginning, I only will use this connector either for an endorsement reason or for a preference reason, and I only use this type of power supply, etc., etc. Will you build me a board? But many of them, and I would say an overwhelming majority of them, don't have these thoughts in mind in advance. They generally are relying on what I tell them in terms of my advice and counsel on what's going to make the best rig for them. And in most cases, they follow that advice because they're trusting you as a professional to steer them in the right direction. And that doesn't mean that by recommending one power supply or another, that means that I'm bad at my job. But I'm just saying that the majority of rig builders are going to have preferences, and they're going to impart those preferences for the people that they build for. And so you're going to see certain rig builders follow a certain path that may be dissimilar. But I would still say when you look overwhelmingly, as I said, about the body of rig builders and the things that they use, they are fairly consistent on the idea of soldered connections. So let's look at some of these builders and what they say of soldered versus solderless connections. We're going to be looking all the way from the beginning with Paul Rivera, who was building rigs back in 1974, all the way to contemporary rig builders and where they stand on soldered versus solderless. Now, I had a conversation with Paul about a month ago where we talked about the very idea of solderless versus soldered connectors, and Paul shares a lot of my same opinions. Here's a little clip of that. What's your take on solderless cables? Because that's one thing that we get hammered on all the time, where people are like, we put out videos and like, oh, that took so long, why didn't you just use solderless cables?
Okay, here's the deal. Is anytime that you have a connection, you're going to have condensation, oxidation, whatever else in the...
I've been saying it.
I'm there,
It's
right?
It's not a gas-tight connection.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, there's really the two ways you should do it. It has to be mechanically secure, and then it has to be soldered. So, I mean, if you go to the military and you say, "Oh yeah, we're going to use like those nice 80-pin Bendixes," yeah, we'll just press the wire and they'll go like, so that's it.
Yeah, I mean,
so I'm not a fan of wire to make a long.
He and I agree that soldered is superior to solderless, not just as an opinion, but actually as a scientific fact. The physics of a gas-tight connection are what they are. So Bradshaw says this: "I hate solderless cables," exclaims Bradshaw. "I'm sorry, but if you want something done right and you want the thing to last, then you have to solder your connections. If a musician doesn't want to get into soldering, that's fine, but they do so at their own peril." I don't know about you, but that sounded like a pretty emphatic response from Robert Bradshaw, who's arguably the person that really took the whole pedal board thing and elevated the whole MIDI switching and all that. He's the guy that's employed by everybody from The Edge to, in U2 and John Mayer and many, many more. He is sort of the standard by which everything is measured by in pedal board talk, in pedal board lineage. So that is although maybe not scientifically based in the response, I think a pretty emphatic reason that he believes that solderless connections are in no way superior to soldered. Now, the next guy to come in that lineage, following from Rivera to Robert Bradshaw, is then Dave Friedman. And Dave Friedman actually makes a statement not only in this article, but also online on one of his web forums where he states his opinions regarding solderless cables. Let's take a look at that. Dave says, "For some people, I use George L cables, but I use soldered on ends rather than the George L solderless connection. The cable sounds really good, but there is a serious potential for failure using non-soldered ends, largely because the majority of people who use George L cable for their boards don't cut the cable exactly right, and the ends don't connect properly. Personally, I would say buy some short angle-to-angle soldered cables at a store and save yourself a lot of trouble." Now, there's another part to this that Dave posted on his web forum. Let me read that. So on his forum, he was asked if he still preferred soldered to solderless connections. And Dave's response was, "Yes, I never will trust a solderless plug. Just too much troubleshooting on a gig if something goes wrong. It could be anywhere." So again, these are 2 points of evidence that show that another major rig builder who has been very influential in the industry will not use a solderless connection. Now granted, he's talking about George L's in the very first statement, which is a lot different than the quality of the newer stuff like the Evidence SIS, which I do believe is the superior connector if you are going to go with a solderless connection. However, he still stands, even in his forum more recently, that he does not approve of the use of solderless connections in his rig. But he's not the only one. Let's move on to more current builders. I'm going to take a look at Mike Vegas, who's part of Nice Rag Canada, builds incredible rigs. Let's see what Mike has to say. We had a little conversation on Facebook. He gave me permission to share his findings. So Mike's response was this: 1. Solderless is fake news. Solderless is a consumer cash grab invented by margin skimming losers. 2. Someone else's ignorance is not equal to my skill and experience. 3. I live in Canada. Most of the gear I build gets used in Canada. Thermal expansion and contraction from -40 Fahrenheit to 85 Fahrenheit is okay for bridges that are designed that way, not so much for electronic connections. So as you can see, Mike is also not a fan of solderless connections. He's also put this quite emphatically in his statement. And I think as you can see, so far, when we're talking about current and past rig builders throughout history, have not endorsed this. Even now, when we see modern day rig builders, if we're looking at the body of work, we are not seeing solderless cables as the standard whatsoever. But it doesn't just stop here. I want to follow up with Brian Omilion from Omilion Audio and see what he says. Now, I talked with Brian about whether he prefers solder or solderless connectors, and you can see just by the evidence of his work that he's definitely a proponent of soldered, but I asked him about his particular experience, and he recalled to me that when he first started out, he was using some solderless cables. Sometimes this was by customer request. Again, he works through Guitar Sanctuary, which is a great dealership. We're going to be carrying our pedals here any day now, in fact, out in McKinney, Texas, just outside of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And he said that mostly customers would request it and then he would honor the request. Obviously, he has an obligation to do that. He's working for a retail establishment that, they want to give the best possible customer service. But all things being equal, and at this point, I think with Brian having developed enough of a reputation on his own, he exclusively uses soldered cables, recommends soldered cables wherever possible. And in fact, he said with some of the pros that come into the shop, some guys that we would all recognize the name of, he's actually had to replace some solderless cable kits that were used on some rig builds that were done by other people in order to make them more reliable because they were experiencing failures. So that was definitely, in his opinion, to be the best way to get the most reliable connection, and actually has converted over a lot of pro rigs to soldered connection because of the inherent reliability issue. Now, there's a few other rig builders that I didn't get a chance to speak with. One of those is XTS, Exactone, over in Nashville, Tennessee. Again, I don't see any evidence on any of their rigs of ever using solderless connections. They all appear to be soldered by everything that I've seen. And there's also, of course, Pete Cornish, that's one of the old school original rig builders, back with Paul Rivera. And again, I've never seen any solderless connections on any of his rigs. Again, most of his stuff is wired internally anyway, so I don't really even know that that falls into place exactly as far as an apples to apples. But I do know that he solders all of his connections, and the patch cables that he sells through his website are all soldered. So I'm assuming if we're looking again at the large body of work and all the rig builders that are out there, we're seeing that this is not a pervasive practice. There may be singular examples of people that use solderless connections, but it is not the standard. It is not the way that professional rigs are designed to be built if they're supposed to last with any amount of longevity and reliability over time. And this is why you see this is a pervasive practice amongst rig builders. Now, I'm not including myself in this group of rig builders because I'm just doing this for the purposes of YouTube and trying to get information out there to you so that you can make a better rig. So I don't have a dog in this fight. If you want to use solderless cables, please be my guest. As I've said, there's a time and a place for this. If you need to get something built fast, you don't have any experience soldering, I think it's a great way to get off the ground and going. You can run signal through it and you'll be okay. Now there's going to be a timeline on how long that lasts. And there are singular examples of people saying, well, I had Georgels and they've lasted for 20 years. And that's great. If they've worked and you like them, that's great. The thing I would caution though is that you're forced to use, in most cases, the cable that the manufacturer has designed the plug around. So if you buy a Georgel cable, you have to use the Georgel connector. If you use Evidence Audio, you have to use the Evidence Audio cable. Now Evidence makes an incredible cable. It's extremely well built and very, very high quality, but you're forced to use their connection and you're forced to use their cable if you want to use their connector. So you don't have the option to actually choose a neutral cable that's going to work for your particular rig. So if you're like me and you know that Mogami 2319 is one of the best, most neutral guitar cables out there, I can't just go and pick up any old solderless connection and use it with that cable. I have to use the manufacturer's cable, the manufacturer's the plug, and the cable to use those together. Now there may be some exceptions. Maybe there's a solderless company that I don't know of that you can use any diameter cable and any type of cable and use it. But it's still not going to be gas tight. It's not going to be as reliable as a solder connection. And I think I've given you the body of evidence along with the body of rig builders that really help validate that this is something that you want to consider when you're building your next rig or you're considering buying more cables. Again, there's a time and place for solderless, but if your goal is to have absolute reliability and longevity for your rig, you need to go soldered. I know that was a lot. There's a lot of solder, there's a lot of solderless thrown in there, there's a lot of body of works thrown in there. I thank you for hanging in there with me. Again, my intent here is to give you the information and then you can go and do with it what you want. I don't sell cables, I don't sell solderless kits, I don't sell soldered kits, I don't sell any of that stuff. I'm just giving you the information so that you can go and decide for yourself what's going to be most workable for you. There's a bunch of different companies that do offer soldering of custom cables, not just instrument cables, but patch cables. You can check out our friends at Revelation Cable. They will build you custom cables and they're extremely, extremely reasonable for what they are. Again, I really like Mogami 2524 and Mogami 2319. That's almost exclusively what I use on my pedal boards. Many of the major rig builders also use the same. It sounds great, it's very easy to use, and extremely reliable, well shielded. All the bullet points that you need to hit when you're looking for a high quality cable. So I highly recommend that you check out those guys if you don't know how to solder or you just want somebody to build it for you. And if you do want to solder and do it yourself, I have some great videos which you can see up here where it'll teach you how to solder. I'm giving you my best tips on how to get good quality soldered connections, and I've also listed all the bulk cable and connectors that I like to use in order to make my cables, so you can copy me, do the exact same thing, and have a really nice quality soldered cable that you do yourself. And once you know how to solder, this is a skill that will last you your lifetime. It's like riding a bike. You will never have to buy cables again. Well, if you ride a bike, you will have to buy cables, but you'll never have to buy cables that are pre-made ever again. So that'll save you some dough, and it'll save you some time. If you think I'm completely crazy or that I have insulted your intelligence in some way, please tell me in the comments below. I'd like to hear from you, and I'd like to have further discussions about this. If there's solderless cables that I don't know about that are making gas-tight connections, that'll blow my mind. So go ahead and tell me in the comments below. Until next time, I'm Uncle Mason, the Rig Doctor.